National Pork Board takes that very seriously. We follow the Sherman Act and want to make sure that when we do have gatherings of producers, competitors, packers, retailers, and the others, that we don't inadvertently drift into a spot that would break the law. And we're going to start off, whoops, I'm going to back you up, Evan. Hang on a second. I'm going to introduce the panelists here this morning. I've got a really nice cross-section available for you here. So I'm going to start here over on the far side with Mike Paustian. So Mike, not only is he a third-generation pork producer from Walcott over in eastern Iowa, he's also a trained microbiologist, kind of an odd combination, you think, from hog farming. But this has been a real attribute as Mike has helped the U.S. pork industry think through some of these issues we're going to be dealing with today. After receiving his doctorate in microbiology from the University of Minnesota, Mike worked as a scientist at the USDA National Animal Disease Center. And today, Mike applies his scientific perspective to their family's corn, soybean, and farrow-to-finish operations. So if you've ever been by the world's largest truck stop on I-80, Mike's farm is immediately behind the truck stop. Mike is past president of the Iowa Pork Producers Association and has also served on the National Pork Board Steering Committee for the responsible use of gene editing. So please give a hand to welcome Mike. So in the middle, dressed very nicely today, thank you, Randy. Randy Riley has been involved in the produce area, so think about fruits and vegetables in the food system his entire career. I had the pleasure of meeting Randy here earlier this spring. We had a video call to talk through what he could bring to this conversation around gene editing outside of livestock. And so Randy started out as a produce clerk and worked his way all to the top, served as Director of Produce Merchandising and Procurement for Kroger, one of the nation's largest grocery store chains. Today is the owner of GoldenSun Insights, and he applies his food chain experience to strategically support the fresh produce supply chain. And Randy is going to give us that retailer perspective on, well, if you make a gene-edited pig, will the grocery stores be willing to sell it, right? That's part of the plan. So please welcome Randy. And our speaker next is going to be Evan. So Evan represents the University of Missouri, Mizzou, Livestock Engineering Mule Team?
Yep. MU Livestock Engineering Team. Yep.
Got it. Interesting acronym. It conducts research for the National Swine Research and Research Center on the Somatic Cell Genome Editing Consortium. Sounds complicated. Okay. Now, most of you may or may not know, but Mizzou, University of Missouri, is kind of the leading epicenter for gene editing in livestock here in the United States. And so Evan is deeply involved in that work that's going on there, really on the cutting edge of this science. Evan is currently working with Dr. Kevin Wells' lab, who is also a known pioneer, a researcher in this area. And he's en route pursuing his doctoral degree in genetic engineering. And Evan's really working on how do we develop economically viable pork to meet the demands of a growing global population. And so I'm going to turn the clicker over to Evan, and what we've asked Evan to do was hop in and just provide a little bit of a baseline of what are some of the terms, what are some things that are going on. You know, we see the tip of the iceberg here when we hear about a PRRS-resistant pig, but there's a lot of other things going on in the industry. So let's welcome Evan, and we'll turn it over to him.
So I want to thank you all for the opportunity to come and talk about genetic engineering in swine, something that I'm very, very passionate about. But I want to talk about the important part first. The regulatory environment is currently the #1 obstacle for any genetically engineered product to make it to market. So I wanted to introduce some terms that we as genetic engineers use, the simple action that pertains to, and then the text editing version of that word. So when we look at genome editing, or genome being the accumulation of all of the genes that make up a pig, we as genetic engineers can do a number of different things. So one of the first things we can do is we can make a transgenic pig where we see a gene from a different species that we think is interesting. We read the sequence of that gene, we copy it, and we write it into the pig version of that gene, and then we put it into the pig genome. And so we effectively transfer that gene through intermediates into a pig. And the editing term would simply be to copy and paste that. So if we see a gene that is particularly interesting, we want more of that gene, we can use a cisgenic technology where we just give it an extra copy, or we duplicate that gene so we just get more expression of that gene. A knockout is simply to remove gene function. And we can do that in a number of different ways, but effectively what we're doing is deleting that gene. And, the next term is something that I've been told not to say in situations like this many times because it has so much baggage around it. But in mutation, when a genetic engineer says mutation or mutate a gene, we simply mean a change. And that can be as small as a single base, or it can be large changes within that gene. And that's just a simple change of spelling or punctuation of that gene itself. And a newer technology is introgression, something that's particularly interesting to me. Introgression is where we see a version of a gene in a pig, and we want to move that version of that gene over to a different pig. So we're not going from a different species, we're going within a species, so we're just changing the version to a more optimal version of that gene itself. So I don't want to take anything away from traditional breeding strategies. Using genetics, understanding growth parameters, and selecting for that, the poultry industry was able to do some remarkable things with their broilers. So a 56-day broiler effectively doubled in size from 1957 to 1978, and then effectively doubled again from 1978 to 2005. No genetic engineering was done, just simply selecting for the best growers in the flock. And so what can a genetic engineer bring to this sort of approach? So that previous slide took 40 years for that to occur. A lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of resources were put into that. So in 1982, a group between the University of Washington and the University of Pennsylvania were able to have a similar effect. So they made a transgene, so a gene from a different species, and put it into a mouse. And that gene was a growth hormone gene. And so when they looked at the siblings from a single litter at time points after birth, they found that the transgenic animals were almost double the size of their non-transgenic siblings. So that's pretty impressive in my mind. But the more impressive thing is that it took 4 weeks to do all of this, not 40 years. So genetic engineering is an incredibly powerful tool when used appropriately. And so who cares about mice? Let's talk about some ag animal. So when we look at salmon, the same approach was attempted in 1992. The first paper was in 1992, where they took a growth hormone and put it into a salmon with some different regulatory elements around that. And when you look at the salmon itself, so on this right panel, that big salmon and the small salmon are the same age. The large salmon is a transgenic salmon expressing a different level of growth hormone compared to its non-transgenic sibling. And when you look at the time it takes for those transgenic salmon to reach market weight, it's approximately half the time of their non-transgenic counterparts. That's pretty impressive. With just a single gene inserted into the genome, we're able to reach the market in half the time. So I circled the times up there. So for reference, 1982 was the year I was born. That was whenever this was first shown to be possible. And it wasn't approved for human consumption until 2015. That was after I graduated college. That's a long time, a lot of resources, a lot of money was spent to show that these fish were just as safe, just as nutritious as their non-transgenic counterparts. And those are actually available for consumption today. So the status of gene editing technology, any modification that can be designed can be made. So if you come to me and you say, I want this sequence of DNA, you write it on a napkin, you bring it up to me and you say, I want it here in the genome, we can do it. It may take us some time and it's going to take some money, but it's all possible now. All phenotypes can be modified. That's the biggest word that my advisor told me that I will use in this slide. All phenotypes can be modified. Any trait can be modified. We can add genes, we can duplicate genes, we can bring in genes from other species or other lines of a pig that we want to move into a different line. So part of this is to look at what's coming down the pipeline. So here's a list of things that I know of that are coming down the pipeline, but it's an iceberg. You only really see a small amount of what people are working on because you don't share some of your proprietary information with your competitors. So these are the topics that I know people are working on, but I know that there are other approaches and other focuses in other areas. I think it's important to note here that I'm very passionate about genetic engineering and its application to disease resistance. But I think if we put ourselves in our shoes 50 years down the road from now, nutrition and digestion will actually be the most important thing that we as genetic engineers can do. When you look at the cost of animal agriculture, feed makes up a huge component of that. So if we can be more efficient with what we give our pigs, then we as an industry can be more efficient. So these are really exciting times as a genetic engineer. The only limitations to genetic engineering are imagination and money. There are no technical limitations to what we can do, and those technical limits are actually being lowered every day by new technologies coming on board. The only limit to these products coming to market is actually the regulatory environment that we currently have. So is this the tool to end all be all? I think it's a tool that needs to be in the toolbox. I don't think it's going to ever replace traditional breeding strategies, but I think it's a tool that should be available to producers moving forward to rapidly address some of the issues facing the industry that come up and be a little bit more nimble.
All right. Yep. Thanks very much, Evan. Make sure this is on. There's a little bit of just laying the groundwork of some terms, and I think those terms are very important because we often hear terms like GMOs, genetically modified organisms. We've heard that over the past 20 years when some of the initial work in biotechnology was happening in the crop space. And it's wildly misunderstood and misinterpreted throughout society globally. And now, lo and behold, we're bringing something additional to the table, right, of gene editing. And it's real easy to start confusing and mixing these terms up. And I want to talk a little bit here about the Pork Board's role before we go to Randy. You know, our role is to support research, promotion, and education for the U.S. pork industry, both on the producer side and on the consumer side. And so our role here in all of this is really one of making sure that you as pork producers and consumers really understand what's going on and can make a choice in what you want to do, what you want to buy, which production systems or methods you want to use. We don't call balls and strikes on that at the Pork Board, but we do have an obligation. Our board has established a technology policy dating back to 2011, and it really sets forth a balancing test that the Pork Board and your pork checkoff is very pro-science, pro-innovation, pro-facts. We're a science-based organization. But we also have to balance that with consumer acceptance because we have the obligation to also promote pork consumption. So those are the two things that we're trying to balance here on your behalf at the checkoff. So next, I'd like to go to Randy and talk a little bit about your experience in the retail grocery world and what are you seeing in market and how's that consumer side playing out in your mind?
Yeah, appreciate that. So maybe it'd be good to start a little bit on my background, just to kind of elaborate on what you started the discussion here today. So I spent 29 years at retail, 10 of them at Winn-Dixie, 19 of them at Kroger. And the last 5 years of those 29 years, I led the produce operation for the company. So fruits and vegetables is what I know. I don't know pork. It's been interesting the last couple of weeks trying to learn your industry and learn this specific topic on your industry. And the glaring learning that I took away from all of that is there are significant parallels between what you're facing and what we face in the fresh produce operation. So since leaving Kroger, I own a company called GoldenSun Insights. And basically what we are is we're a consulting company that operates in the fresh produce space. We house a pool of clients all up and down the produce value chain from genetics all the way to wholesale. And what we essentially do is prepare them and educate them on how to go to market, not only with their products, but their messaging and their behavior to retailers, because we think that's super important. I bring that up just because when you think about this particular topic, how similar the pork industry is to the fresh fruit and vegetable industry in terms of messaging and behavior. So I go back to Evan's slide, and I'm going to pick on Evan just briefly. All right. You had that one slide with all of those terms, and it was mind-blowing for me to read that. Because from a consumer standpoint, when they read that, it's skepticism, they're afraid, because all you're doing is altering the products that I'm putting into my body. And I say that because that's what we heard in the fresh fruit and vegetable space. So let me go down a road of, I think the produce industry is a little bit ahead of the pork industry in terms of this particular topic. There's a couple of products already in the market that are gene edited, that have been approved by the legislative bodies that Evan spoke to earlier. You know, one of them is the Arctic apple. So revolutionary in terms of gaining approval, gaining entry into the marketplace. The benefit that gene editing was to provide to that particular product was that it was non-browning, right? How many of us as unbiased consumers appreciate the fact that we can cut into an apple and it doesn't turn on us, right? Because when it turns, what does that represent? Bad quality, decay, and it's time to throw it away, which is waste, okay? So the Arctic apple essentially solved that. Unfortunately, there's competitors to that product that have a natural approach to a non-browning solution of apples. So what did the Arctic apple solve? In the mind of the consumer, nothing, that they can't get replaced by a competing item, okay? So I go down this road just to say, from a consumer acceptance standpoint, what is the message and how do we translate it to them effectively and transparently? You know, another item that's in the marketplace today is this pink pineapple. Have y'all seen the pink pineapple? Okay, gene edited. And the benefit of this is it's a new variety, right? It's a pineapple that's pink. Sounds real cool. In the fresh produce space, new varieties, new colors, new flavor experiences are at the top of the priority meter in terms of why consumers shop or pick certain items at certain locations, okay? So the magnitude of this goes up exponentially. The problem with it is it's not articulated transparently to the consumer, okay? When you look at the label, it may say gene edited on it, but it's in small font, coloring that doesn't naturally pop to the consumer. And so the perception of this from the consumer base is this is a transparency issue. And so I'm just using those two examples to say one didn't solve a need state and the other one is being perceived as a transparency nightmare. And so the lesson here is to say, if you're going to go down this road, how do you solve those two things to the consumer, okay? Now, a final example before I turn it over, word on the street is that here real soon, the American consumer will be able to enjoy a pitless cherry. Now think about that. 4 weeks out of the calendar year, cherries are the #1 sales item in the produce department, okay? So it's meaningful to the retailer and it's meaningful to the consumer is what that KPI represents. Unfortunately, we know the vast majority of consumers that walk into a retail store do not purchase cherries because it's an inconvenience on an experience standpoint, right? The pit. Nobody wants to spit pits anymore. So this company essentially has solved a need state for a consumer, and their intentions is to be super transparent with everybody on it in their quest to gain approval of it. And so I just wanted to start with that, and hopefully we can have a discussion a little bit more on transparency and messaging.
Thanks very much, Randy. And that's really at the crux of a lot of what we're trying to accomplish here is, you know, fundamentally, folks, the old adage, the genie's out of the bottle. I think Evan has talked about this. This technology is available globally. And compared to where biotechnology was, say, in the late 80s, early 90s, which was incredibly expensive, only a few companies were sophisticated enough to handle it and manage it, and they were more than likely in the United States. Today, gene editing is relatively inexpensive compared to where we were 25, 30 years ago, and it's widely available around the world. And I think that's one of the points you were making, Evan, on the regulatory structure of what is the global regulatory environment going to look like, who is setting those global standards, and what are the expectations of citizens around the world of that point you were making as well, Randy. So next, I'm going to go to Mike. Mike is a pork producer, and we're here at World Pork Expo. And so Mike, be interested in your thoughts as someone, maybe you want to talk a little bit about the Coalition for Responsible Gene Editing in Ag that you supported the pork industry in, and then how are you thinking about this in your operation?
Yeah, sure. So, there's been a lot of talk behind the scenes for several years now about how to launch gene-edited products onto the market, right? And as we've heard, some have already made it to the market, but there's a lot more in the pipeline that are coming. And so, Randy touched on transparency, and that's a huge issue, obviously, with consumers. And so, I represented pork producers on a group that was putting together a framework for the responsible use of gene editing. And so the idea behind this is it's a set of rules, many of which have to do with transparency and public disclosure of information that companies can voluntarily sign on to be a part of it. And so the thought is this is a way to provide some additional consumer trust in the process, right? Because regulation is the rules that everybody has to follow, but just getting regulatory approval doesn't mean you have consumer acceptance, right? Because there's not a lot of transparency in the regulatory process usually. It's proprietary secrets, and so that information usually isn't made available to the public. So there's a lot of work in that area right now of how do we add confidence to these new technologies as they come to market. Because I think as you've heard, I describe it as like a three-legged stool basically, right? We have the science, we have the regulation, and we have consumers, right? We need to understand the science so that we know, what kind of modifications to make that could be of benefit to producers and consumers. We need an appropriate regulatory environment, right? And I say appropriate because if it's too onerous, then only a select few will be able to have the resources to make it through that, and so we won't have much development of the technology because only the very experienced or very well-funded companies will be able to navigate that. If there's no regulation, then we may have an issue with consumer acceptance, right? Because it's like, well, has anybody looked at this and said it's safe, right? So we need appropriate regulation. And then the third part, what Randy was just talking about, consumer acceptance, right? Because we can go through all this work, we can do all this, it can be the greatest thing ever, but if consumers kind of have like I don't know kind of feeling about it, then it was all for nothing, right? And so that's the challenge that we're faced with here, and we, as Bill mentioned, we have this baggage of GMOs kind of hanging over all of this, right? And so if there was a lesson that we all should have learned from when GMO technology was originally rolled out, it's that we need to figure out how to talk about this with consumers. And we can't just, and I say we as the whole industry, us as producers, companies who are working on the technology, researchers, everybody. One of the mistakes, I think, in hindsight that was made with GMOs is we talked about the benefits to the producers, right? Because that's where most of the benefits were. There were a lot of benefits to producers. Producers rapidly adopted the technology because they could see the benefit and the value it added to their operation. So we need to go beyond that, though, for gene editing, I think. And so, like, just for example, say you have a disease-resistant pig, right? That was created with gene editing. So obviously there's benefit to the producer there, right? If I have a gene-edited pig that is more disease-resistant, that has the potential to make my farm more profitable, right? Consumer doesn't care about that at all, okay? What the consumer cares about, for we know from talking to consumers, one of the things they care about is antibiotic usage, right? We've heard that loud and clear. Consumers are very concerned about antibiotic usage in livestock. So if we're going to talk about a disease-resistant pig with consumers, we need to talk about how that fits in and solves one of their concerns. So instead of talking about how that pig will make producers more profitable, we can talk about how pigs that are disease-resistant will require fewer antibiotics, right? So there we are solving a concern of the consumer. Like Randy was talking about, it's like we have to meet the consumer where they're at. We can't just talk about how great we think it is. We have to listen to the consumer, find out what their concerns are, and say, I think this is going to be something that can help address that concern of yours. So that's kind of what I think about when I think about the role that all of us have to play in talking about this, whether we're talking with legislators, talking with consumers, talking with the companies that we do business with. You know, these are some of the things that we can be talking about. You know, as a producer, you know, I'm looking at this like as another tool in our toolbox, like Evan mentioned. You know, for some producers, maybe it'll solve an important concern of theirs. If your sow herd is breaking with PRRS every other year, I think you're going to be very interested in a PRRS-resistant pig because that might help. For others that maybe aren't in a hog-dense area, maybe it's not as high on the priority list. But you know, the other day I was thinking about this. It's kind of the same idea as whether you decide to put filters on your barn, right? That's another tool you can use to try to prevent your herd from being infected. Well, this is maybe another tool that you would have to choose from. Doesn't mean everybody's going to have to use it or everybody's going to want to use it, but it'd be nice if it was available to solve a particular problem, right?
Thanks, Mike. And I want to talk a little bit about this, the Coalition for Responsible Gene Editing in Agriculture, also very long term, Evan, is something that's been around. The Center for Food Integrity and Look East helped jumpstart that. Mike, you want to just talk just briefly the cross-section of people or organizations or commodities that were involved?
Yeah, so that the group that's been involved with that is up and down the whole retail chain, so or the whole food supply chain. So there's retail, food service, plant breeding organizations, animal organizations. This is being done in microbes too. So people are working on bacteria that have been gene edited, and then also some kind of consumer advocacy groups and things like that as well. So very, very comprehensive group of people, and which at times makes the process frustratingly slow. But at the end of the day, I think they've come up with a framework that covers a lot of the bases and checks a lot of the boxes off as far as something that is workable for companies that are going to participate in it. Because if it's too much of a hassle and there's no perceived benefit, then companies aren't going to sign on for it anyway. So it's definitely workable, but it also gets into enough detail that it's going to provide enough information to consumers, or it's companies that choose to adopt the framework will be making some commitments to communicate with consumers about what they're doing and how they're doing it, kind of thing. So I think they've already had some companies sign on to it. There's a lot of others that are interested in signing on to it. So I think it's something that's starting to gain some traction, and hopefully will go a long ways to helping build confidence all along the supply chain in the technology.
Thanks, Mike. And want to talk a little bit about this, and we'll get into some questions here. One of the things we discovered on this journey, with a lot of conversations with ethicists, with doctors, with consumers, farmers, and you mentioned the whole group, we did a series of meetings both in the U.S. and around the world called CRISPR conferences, and shorthand for the CRISPR gene editing technique that's fairly popular. Here's what we learned. It's available in humans, right? So there's scientific research going on with gene editing in people. Also, you've heard from livestock, and we also heard from plants. And what we picked up in talking to a lot of different people and a lot of different consumers was this dichotomy of, oh, I have an uncle that has Alzheimer's. Could gene editing somehow prove to help that, perhaps sometime in the future? I think I can support that because I've seen what's happened to my uncle and his quality of life. But on the flip side, they said, if I want a group of designer babies as tall as Mike Paustian to create a basketball team, consumers say, I don't really like that. I don't like that piece, right? And then when you come to livestock, it's somewhat similar. Oh, so you mean to say if we could eliminate a disease or help with something with animal health or animal welfare, I could probably support that. But if you're going to produce a designer pig that's double muscled or something really weird, no, I don't want any part of that. And the same thing then holds true on the crop side as well. So what we're seeing is that the consumer, pretty smart, pretty open-minded, they see opportunities for it to maybe provide some benefits, but then they also see opportunities for it to be misused like any other tool. So Randy, I want to come to you and talk a little bit about that dichotomy, that teeter-totter back and forth, and talk to me of what you've seen in the produce industry there, and how is that playing out?
Yeah, so interesting perspective you just gave. And so I would say, the caveat to all that is in the fresh fruit and vegetable space, we've done a nice job to mask a lot of what's happening behind the scenes to the consumer. So masking for whatever reason. But my point in this is to say that the consumer just doesn't understand what's going from end to end in terms of what the producer or grower or supplier faces on a day in and day out standpoint. I go down this road because, think about your dissertation in terms of there's some level of acceptance when it's health related. There's zero level of acceptance when it's food related, or so it seems, right? And so the question really becomes is what separates health versus food, because to many of us, they're connected. One feeds the other in many different ways. But there's this growing sentiment that when it comes to my food, thou shalt not, but to my health, if it can greatly benefit me, thou shalt. And so, I go down this road to say, consumers seem to be split on this. And when I say split, I don't necessarily mean 50-50. I mean, we can debate about the percentages, but split in the sense that those that have a high perception or a positive perception around technologies and advancements and processes or procedures seem to be accepting of technology like gene editing.
Right.
And those that are indifferent to it or don't know it or opposed to it are the ones that we have to start targeting on an education and transparency standpoint. The thing that quickly comes to my mind that's similar to this subject is in the fresh fruit and vegetable space, there's technology, and there's been technology for quite some time on how to extend the shelf life of fresh produce. Now, when you think about it from a consumer standpoint, that sounds great, because what's the leading frustration in terms of consumers buying fresh produce is it goes bad on the counter, right? And then you blame the retailer, and the retailer then blames the grower, and it's just controversy up and down that value chain. But there's technology out now that will extend that shelf life by 2, 7, 14 days, and that just sounds wonderful, doesn't it? And the messaging to the consumer was always around this is organic in nature, this is good for the product, has zero effect on the human body, and much of it is derived from plant materials. So I think in that particular industry, they've done a nice job in being consistent in their messaging, and they don't have these massive technological terms and phrases attached to them, which I think is the foundation problem of this particular subject. I don't know if that answered your question.
Well, it's very helpful because it plays right into what I want to talk to Evan about, and that is science is science, right? The sun comes up in the east and goes down in the west. And if someone says otherwise, sorry, but you're just wrong. And so we've got this rub of what is scientifically accurate and honest, but yet this large gap, right, between this really smart guy here that knows way more than I ever will, but how do we get that into the hands of a layperson? We were joking in the back of the room before this started, and we told Evan, he said, you have to tell your whole PhD experience in 5 minutes. And therein lies the challenge, right? Of how do you take everything that you know to be accurate and honest and true and factual, but try to help a group of pork producers here at Expo to just understand the basics with a few simple words in about 5 minutes. So, Evan, talk to me about the scientific community and, I don't know, maybe your frustrations or where you see opportunities to bridge that gap that Randy just alluded to.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think the biggest frustration in my mind is kind of the academic culture that we need to teach other academicians what we're doing. And that's true for most scientists, but I'm not a scientist, I'm an engineer. I want to solve problems. And so what I need to do is use the scientists to do these discoveries, to figure out what things are doing, how we can change those. And then as an engineer, I figure out, okay, how can I take this and I apply it to this real world problem? Okay. And then whenever I figure out how to solve that real world problem, it's then the task is then to communicate why this is important. Is it a welfare? Is it a health? Is it a nutrition thing? And be able to effectively communicate not I hate the word lay person, but to a person who's not a genetic engineer, this is all a different language. So be able to say, we cut this out of this genome, we took this out of this animal, we wrote it in the pig version, and we put it into the pig to do this for welfare. We wanted to knock out this gene so that it cannot get sick. We, with my group, they knocked out a receptor called CD163. CD163 means nothing to most of you, I assume, but it's a receptor that's very important for PERS gaining access to the cell. So if we can knock out that receptor, or at least a part of that receptor, we now have a pig that cannot get PERS. Not like it gets sick and it kind of transmits. It will not get sick, it will not transmit. And so changing the story from, oh, we knocked out to this receptor and now these pigs are great, it's these pigs do not get sick. They do not have the abortion storm. And I think communicating what we're doing is incredibly important, but I think as an industry as a whole, we have an uphill battle. I mean, on every level of pork production, we have people, the naysayers, I guess, the people who don't want us to do pork production the way we've done it for hundreds of years, or the new way that we're doing it now, whether that's castration or weaning or indoor farming. That we have to be able to communicate even better on all of those levels, gain community trust, gain public trust, both from a producer side and from the scientific side, before we can say, okay, based on this, based on these diseases, based on these nutritional requirements, we did X so that we can be more efficient. We can use less resources. We can be more environmentally friendly. We can have better welfare for not only our pigs, but our workers. I work specifically with influenza, and that's a huge issue, both in terms of the swine industry, but also it has a huge welfare component. I mean, H1N1 is something that's fairly recent, but then the Spanish swine flu is not too far out of memory. So being able to make a pig that the workers, that the pigs cannot get sick, but also the workers cannot get influenza from the pig, leading to the next global pandemic not coming from pigs. If we can cut that flow, we can have a huge impact on the health of the pig, but also global perception, because it's not just a pig issue, it's a pig issue and a human issue, that we can stop that flow of zoonotic or diseases that can go between humans and animals. If we can stop that flow of disease, I think that's a valuable use for genetic engineering. And I think that's something that genetic engineering is uniquely poised to answer and solve. So I think communication, it really needs to be at the forefront of everything we do, and transparency. I've always gone under the assumption that you should never try and hide anything that you wouldn't want to come to light at a later time. So you should be transparent about what you're doing and why. So if someone says, hey, well, why are you doing this? You have an answer. You can say, oh, I'm doing this because of X. And not like you got your hand caught in the cookie jar, but you're actively doing something to help the end product, the consumer, or whatever. But being transparent and communicating throughout, I think, is incredibly important. And that, like I said, science and producers can do a better job, in my opinion, of communicating science and production.
Well, so I think what that does is it starts to beg the question in that supply chain, right? From the science and maybe the investors, and then the companies, and then the farmers and the distributors, and ultimately retailers and consumers. Who bears that communication responsibility? I'm going to ask all three of you that to give us your perception, because we're hearing that we've got to be open, we've got to be transparent, we need to communicate this. Mike, who's supposed to own this? Because it can easily turn into, well, that's Mike's job, not my job.
Right. Yeah, I know. I think, the cop-out answer is, well, we all have a role to play, but, I think to some degree that's true because farmers are still trusted by the general public, right? And so, for the most part, and so we need to, utilize that. If people, it goes back to what I call the whole Monsanto effect, right? It's like Monsanto as a company kind of got demonized as part of the whole GMO rollout and things like that. And so there's this inherent distrust of, big companies, big ag, something like that. And so to me, that means producers need to have a louder voice in communicating some of these ideas, some of these concepts to producers. If we just say, that company made that, so that's their problem to deal with. It's like, well, no, if it's a technology that we as producers want to use, then we need to play an active role in talking about why this is a good thing, right? Because I don't know about a lot of you, but I get that a lot where somebody will be talking to me and they know my family, they know we're a family farm, and they'll say, well, no, this is something that the big ag does, and they'll like describe something that we do on our farm. There's that disconnect there. People think there's all these family farmers, and then there's all these evil corporate farmers, right? And they don't realize that it's all the same people. But it's an issue, and we need to work on that. But I think as producers, we need to not be shy about talking about how, well, number one, why we do what we do, but also how some of these new technologies could benefit our operation. If you can talk to one of your friends from town about why this would be a good thing for them and for you, that will go a long ways more than a press release from some company or something like that. So I think we all have a role to play there. One thing that really piqued my interest was Randy, when you were talking about consistency of messaging. I think that's something that's been lacking in a lot of areas over the years, and I think that's something that this would really benefit from. Because if people are hearing a consistent message from all different, because we as producers have a lot more sway with our, neighbors and people we know in our social circles, but a company with a large marketing budget is obviously going to be able to reach more total number of people. And if both of those groups are saying a similar message, it's going to be a lot more powerful because people are going to be like, oh yeah, I heard that, I read about that, and then that's the same thing that the farmer Mike told me. So I think that could go a long ways to helping with adoption of a new technology like this.
So Randy, who owns the communication responsibility?
Yes, well said. And we would be naive to believe that the retailer will do anything to assist you in this communication. Yeah. And so let me explain that. There's this great debate in terms of grower shippers in the produce sector and retailers on this push-pull model in terms of retailers pushing initiatives to consumers or consumers pulling on the retailer to provide X, whatever X is. And what we have to understand is retailer push initiatives are always of great financial benefit, right? Retailers are in the business to make money, they're in the business to earn share, and they're in business for all of those things. And so the times that they push initiatives upon the consumers to purchase or engage in, there's always a great financial benefit. When it comes to this subject matter, what is the retailer's financial benefit? I don't think there's one that they can naturally see, taste, touch, or smell, right? And so if there's a benefit to your industry to it, the burden rests upon your shoulder to do that, and every retailer will believe and feel that way, okay? Now, that means messaging is super important, messaging is super consistent, and it means that you have to somehow detach yourself from these negative connotations associated with gene editing, everything that Mike was mentioning. But I would also say that when you think about gene editing, what a terrible term to associate to this process. It's just a terrible term, because to the layman, whoever the layman is in whatever industry, it just sounds absolutely abhorrent. So the question really becomes, how do you construct a narrative and messaging in order to create the pull from the consumer, which will naturally create the adoption from the retailer?
Thanks for the honest transparency
Yeah,
on
yeah.
that part. I
Says easy, does hard. Right? Yeah.
So, Evan, same question to you.
So you bring up an interesting point of the marketing of what we're doing. So as a genetic engineer, we do this. It's simple. And whether we want to call it something different or call these animals something new, I think that's in the marketing realm. So I think that, investing and getting upfront and being more proactive versus reactive in the marketing front is really important. But then, everyone's kind of responsible for taking ownership of this. So, on the scientist side, making sure that you have enough evidence, that you've shown that you've done the due diligence to make sure that these products are safe, that they actually are as beneficial to both the pig, the producer, and the consumer, that you say that they are, and show evidence throughout. And I think that there are ways to do that, more collaborative research throughout the marketing chain, from the actual physical gene editing to the public perception of this and the communication of why we're doing this. I think that's all important through the whole chain. And I think that the way to do that is through collaborative efforts, both with academia and with the industry, and then within academia, finding people that have interests that will take that product through all of the rigorous testing and the public perception and the marketing, and how can we be better at what we're doing, as far as telling people why we're doing it and what we're actually doing.
So, science and technology always outruns law and policy. Mike, is gene editing going to go away?
No, the genie's out of the bottle there. We the United States are already behind like Brazil and Argentina.
You've traveled to Brazil, right?
Yeah, and I think farmers in South America have also been rapid adopters of GMO crops, and they saw the benefit that North American producers had, and they've been playing catch up ever since, right? Well, I think a lot of them are seeing gene editing as their chance to jump ahead. And so there are already numerous livestock species that are approved for consumption in many South American countries, and so it's here and it's not going away. The details are a little bit different from country to country, but kind of one of the themes that's emerging is a lot of countries are choosing to have a very minimal amount of regulation for gene-edited livestock that where the edits are replicating naturally occurring traits, right? So that's where one of the situations that Evan was talking about, where you see a beneficial gene in one pig or cow, and you just move it over into another genetic line of the same species. That's kind of already been accepted in the plant world, is if you're making a change that's similar to something that's been found naturally, whatever that means anymore, that isn't going to require a lot of excessive regulatory hurdles. So that's not currently the way it is here in the United States. USDA and FDA are still kind of fighting over who gets to regulate the technology. And so, then there's work being done to try to get that sorted out. But a lot of countries are coming around to that. I don't know if the United States will, but if that's the case, it's really going to open things up a lot, as far as a lot of companies being able to work in that space, because they already have pretty extensive genetic libraries of their herds, and if they're able to say, okay, we've got all these different traits that we know are beneficial, we like Evan mentioned at the beginning, we could spend the next 5 to 10 years trying to breed those into all our different lines the traditional way, or we can use gene editing and just move them all over, right? And so that's where the speed at which these improvements can be made is really going to make a difference. So, it's, Europe is still an outlier, right? The Europeans are still operating under what they call the precautionary principle. So they have not been friendly to GMO crops, and they're, to the frustration of many scientists in Europe, there's a lot of pushback on gene editing too. Now, maybe they'll come around, maybe not, but most of the world is following the lead of the South American countries right now. And so I think you're going to see it spread pretty quickly to Africa and Asia and other places. They all see the benefits, and in many cases, you're talking about countries that do not have a population of consumers that are as food secure as we are and have the luxury of arguing about our food so much. They have real challenges that they're trying to meet. And consumers are much more accepting of solutions to these challenges when they're food insecure. And so I think you're going to see it adopted rapidly in many areas.
So I actually want to jump in on that. So they're actually, the first introgressed species has been approved in the United States. So FDA last year actually approved slick cattle.
I think you got a picture of that.
I do have a picture of that, actually. So this is a naturally occurring shortened version of a receptor. And so whenever you shorten or truncate, it's another word for shorten, whenever you shorten that receptor, you actually end up with a short coat versus a longer coat and more resilient for temperature. So they have greater temperature tolerance. And so that was approved by FDA in 2022. They approved it as a low risk, so they said that this is no different than a naturally occurring slick mutation that's present in other animals. So this, in my mind, is something that's really interesting. I think you talked, when we had a meeting before this, you talked about the libraries that gene editing or gene companies have, or these, so you look through these genetic libraries and you look for interesting traits. You look for things that you can move over. So you find an interesting trait, and you move it into a productive line. And you can do that without having to do years of breeding and then years more of breeding to get back the traits that you lost through those crosses. This, you can do it in one step, one generation. So it's an incredibly powerful technology, but it's also really interesting that FDA has approved it. So this is kind of proof of concept that they've claimed that they are approving the product, not the process. So if the product is not significantly different than a wild type, a normal cow out there, then a genetically engineered version that looks exactly like that can be approved or is just as safe. And so that, in my mind, is really interesting because we can now start applying that to pigs and say, where are interesting genes that already are naturally occurring within the herd, and where can I put those easily?
Thank you. Well, as we're getting close to time here, excuse me, I'm gonna, Randy, you'll get the last parting shot.
Oh, great.
One of the things that the checkoff believes in is choice. It's choice in how you want to raise your hogs, your production methods. We also believe in consumer choice. But the flip side of that coin is non-disparagement, because we're science-based and fact-based. We don't believe in anything. You don't need to throw somebody else under the bus to move your product forward. So let's be honest about the discussions that we're going to be having about gene editing in the coming years. And so, Randy, put it to you, what is the U.S. pork industry's biggest risk at the retail consumer level while believing in choice, but also wanting to avoid that eat this, not that kind of disparagement?
Yeah, so I think the biggest opportunity here is telling the story on what is the benefit to the consumer. What is the benefit? You know, I'm listening to Evan, and this sounds super logical, and it sounds like there's so many benefits associated with slick cattle. But what is the benefit to the consumer? Because ultimately, in order for this to move forward, to get through legislation that you talked about earlier, to get through grower, producer, marketer acceptance, it has to have the consumer acceptance. And consumer acceptance only comes in the form of value or benefit. And I'm separating those two because one is typically around price, value, and benefits typically around flavor, experience, quality, et cetera, et cetera. And so your target audience is not the retailer, it's not the marketer, It's not boards, it's not commissions, it's the consumer. And that's what we're trying to do in the fresh produce space, and we're hitting all the same hurdles and obstacles that you are in this industry. But I think if more industries become aligned in the mission and the objective, which is articulating this to the end consumer, what the benefit and the value is to them, this thing would probably move at a faster pace. You know, I go back to the question that's often asked when we talk about this subject, and it's what label out there resonates with the end consumer base? And I think most people would say it's the USDA organic label, right? And we can sit here and debate for hours the benefit or the transparency or the potential misnomers associated with that label. But at the end of the day, the consumer recognizes it and they see value in it. And fresh fruits and vegetables, all it means to them is no pesticides. Now, everybody in this room knows that that's not true. There are pesticides used on fruit and vegetable that are organic, but they've done a nice job labeling it and associating a story that has created the value to the end consumer. And so that's my plea to you.
All right. Well, with that as the last word, let's give these folks a big hand. Thank you. And again, there's a QR code. You're going to see it throughout the session today. Please get on your phones, log that for a chance to win some prizes. And rest assured, as this is moving forward over the course of the next number of years, please get a hold of us at the Pork Checkoff to make sure that you're well informed about the facts around gene editing. Thanks much. Have a great World Pork Expo.